wedding at Cana, how Jesus meets us in our emptiness. John chapter 2. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 80 to 120 litres. Jesus said to his servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine, after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
Just to say again at the beginning how delighted I am to be able to come and share these talks with you over Lent, beginning obviously this evening, Shrove Tuesday, and going on into Holy Week just before Easter. And 7 talks, all taken, as we know, from St. John's Gospel, in which we're looking at a number of conversations between different people in the Gospel of St. John and Jesus at critical moments in the life of that individual who has that conversation with Jesus, or critical in the life of Jesus himself, particularly as we come to those later conversations nearer to his passion, cross, and resurrection. Now, as we're looking at St. John's Gospel, and I know you're reading it as well in your daily readings, I want to say a word about it, and then we'll look at this particular conversation, which is between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus at the time of this wedding in Cana of Galilee. But some words about St. John's Gospel, which you're probably very familiar with, but I think it's still worth saying. It was the last of the Gospels to be written. It was written probably, we don't know for sure when, but probably around about 90 AD, or possibly a little bit later even. It means that John was now probably in his mid to late 80s. So that gives us hope for those of us who are a little bit older, that there's still lots we can do at that time of life. It's written almost certainly in Ephesus, which is in present-day Turkey. We know that John, possibly with Mary, because he looked after Mary, the mother of Jesus, moved to Ephesus round about, or perhaps a bit before 70 AD, which was the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And he lived in Ephesus for the remaining part of his life, although it's quite probable that he went for a short period of time as an exile, as a punishment for being a Christian, to Patmos, which is in fact not very far away from Ephesus, where he received, which we believe it was him, the Revelation, which is the final book, the Apocalypse, the final book of the Bible. So you have to imagine him in Ephesus, and we're told by a church historian, a man called Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea, which is in Palestine, that at the very end of his life, John used to be carried around on a litter, on a bed, because he couldn't walk. And he would say to people who came up to him, "My little ones, love one another. My little ones, love one another." And that's recorded by Eusebius in his book, which you can get as a Penguin edition even today, and read these things for ourselves. So that's rather a lovely insight into John and his life at Ephesus. And it was there that the gospel was written. And when it was written a little bit later on, it was described by one of the early church fathers, whose name was Clement of Alexandria, as a spiritual gospel. Now, in a sense, they're all spiritual, aren't they? But what he was saying was that this had a kind of resonance and a profundity to it, which made it a gospel which you could never quite get the bottom of, because it was so profound. And so it was called the spiritual gospel, and it was written in a rather different way to the other three gospels, which we generally call the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now, you may know this, but the Gospel of John is built very carefully around 7 signs. And this evening, we're looking at the first sign, which is the miracle of the changing of the water into wine at Cana of Galilee. So there are 7 signs, which start now and go on, in fact, to the very end of the Gospel. The final sign is the great catch of fish in John chapter 21. It's also built around 7 sayings, I am sayings. Jesus says, for instance, I am the resurrection and the life, which we'll come to when we think of the raising of Lazarus from the grave later on in our series. The 7 I am sayings, I am the bread of life, another one. They're all familiar sayings, but so important to the gospel. The gospel is also built around the Jewish feasts in Jerusalem. There is a Galilean ministry, but it's not so marked as in the other Gospels. What we have in St. John's Gospels are these feasts in Jerusalem, the Feast of Tabernacles, of course, the Feast of Passover later on, in which Jesus taught and was in Jerusalem and spoke to the people and indeed the Jewish leaders there. And during these feasts and around them, we have some very long discourses, that's teaching that Jesus gives. And the final one, which is the discourse in the upper room, beginning in John chapter 14, goes on for 2 or 3 chapters and is immensely important. One other last thing to say about the gospel is that there's greater insight in St. John's gospel about the Trinity than in any other gospel. That is the workings together of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there's probably more about that relationship between the 3 of them in the Godhead than in any other gospel. And maybe that was a very deliberate thing for John to do in writing this gospel, to give us that insight into how they, as it were, work together, if we can put it like that. And John is called, as we know, the apostle of love. Or to put it another way, he calls himself the beloved disciple. He doesn't name himself in the gospel, but he talks about the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is interesting. He should do that. I mean, he loved them all, but there was some special relationship between John and Jesus. As we know, John was the one who lay, as it were, on the breast of Jesus in the Passover meal or the Last Supper in the gospel. And today we're going to look in the next few minutes of my talk about how Jesus meets us in emptiness. Around this conversation between Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus himself. And it's interesting just to note this, that this is the first appearance of Mary in the gospel. We don't have any infancy narratives like you do in the synoptic gospels, except for Mark. We go straight into that amazing opening preface to the gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and so on. And so we have Mary here with Jesus at a wedding. Now, weddings have been hard to come by in lockdown over the last year, and I know about that, and I'll say a bit about it in a moment. The Jewish weddings were hugely important in the life of the community. In fact, there's been quite interesting discussion in the press just recently about Orthodox Jews and their weddings in North London and how they should reduce the numbers of people attending because they love a wedding, I imagine. That's why they have all these people. I'm slightly breaking the law at the moment, I think. But in Christ's own day, we find that a wedding probably went on for something like 3 days. It was a lengthy affair. There were different stages to it. And it seems that we've got to the point where maybe the couple have now gone through their betrothal and their marriage, their vows, whatever they exactly did in the Jewish wedding, And now they're all together. Maybe at that time they're going to have toasts and speeches. I don't know exactly how they ran a wedding in the first century Palestine, but it was a big deal. And we almost certainly know that Mary was a relative of the couple who was getting married. That's Mary, the mother of Jesus. So she was invited. She came with her own family, Jesus and the brothers and sisters that he already had, and he was now about 28 years of age. So his family was grown up, the family around him. And not only that, but he came with all the disciples, another 11 hungry and thirsty people. So you can see they were quite a crowd, just that family, let alone everybody else. They were a big guest list. And the wedding proceeded. And then it came to this moment of potential embarrassment and difficulty. And in this conversation between Mary and Jesus, I want to pick up on particularly two things that are said, and then one thing that arises out of that conversation that is said by another person who's in fact the person in charge of the festivities and the feast. And they're kind of things we can reflect on, these simple words, which I think are very telling and very profound. And the first one comes at the beginning of the conversation between Mary and Jesus, where she says simply to him in verse 3, they have no more wine. They've no more wine. Can you imagine it? You know, you're coming to the most important part maybe of the ceremony. Were there going to be toasts? Were there going to be maybe speeches? And they look across to where all the wine is kept and they're completely run dry. And it's going to be a great embarrassment. Well, as I said earlier, Olivia, my wife, and I have arranged 3 weddings. We have 3 daughters. And so we know a bit about arranging a wedding. And it's my job generally to buy the wine, which I'm happy to do for the wedding. And so, you know, I generally consult with the bride and groom with what they're going to eat and what kind of wine they'd like and all that kind of thing. And then go off and purchase it. Don't go across to France necessarily and buy it over there, but buy it locally. And I practically always over order because I don't want to be in the situation that these guys are in here, that suddenly there's not enough wine and we're all embarrassed. And so I slightly over order, and there's no chance of making a trip to the supermarket on the day during the festivities, as that would be very time consuming. But it does mean that when everyone is gone, they haven't drunk everything. You can drink a little bit more as the days or months go by. But there was an impending embarrassment now that there was no more wine. Now, that was a fact in the wedding, but I think, you know, knowing John, it was more than just saying, you know, there isn't any more wine for them to drink. I think he's saying something more profound. The reason for that is that John, if you know him in this gospel, he loves symbolism. He loves metaphors. He loves allegories. In fact, Jesus often teaches in allegories where he says, I am the vine and you are the branches in John chapter 15, and other allegories are to be found in the gospel. So on the one hand, we're hearing, yes, there is a problem here. There needs to be a solution to this catering crisis. But there's also something more profound going on as well. And I think it's this, that John is saying through this story that actually Judaism and the old ways and trying to keep the law, all of that has run dry. There is no more wine. You know, we've come to the end of the old ways. Something new, something dynamic, something fresh, something wonderful needs now to happen. And I get that particularly by reading back to those amazing opening words in the prologue of the gospel, which you'll know well and would have been read, I'm sure, at Christmas several times in your hearing, where we're told these words. For the law was given through Moses, Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Here's a contrast. The law came from Moses. That was one dispensation. But grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. And I think in a way, what John is telling us and what Jesus is telling us indeed in this miracle is that the old ways are coming to an end and a new way is beginning. And this Gospel of St. John is going to tell us what that new way is all about. That's not only emptiness, as far as producing wine for the wedding is concerned, but the spiritual emptiness in the life of the nation and its future, as far as its spiritual life is concerned. How does Jesus meet us in our emptiness is kind of the question that we're looking at this evening. And another way of looking at it is in fact our own personal lives, because from time to time we ourselves feel, don't we, empty or overwhelmed by the things that we're having to face, and not least, of course, in this last year of this pandemic and how that's affected us all. I was very touched just a few weeks ago when I was reading an article in the paper about someone who lost their parent at the beginning of this year in 2021. And she was a professor, Professor Greenhalgh, and she wrote a message, I think, for everyone else to read and to share in, and she put it on Twitter. It's pretty poignant. I'm going to read it out. It says, "Goodbye, Mum. You died of COVID-19 days before you were due to be vaccinated. You told them in the hospital to give the ventilator to somebody else. I said a FaceTime farewell from a hospital car park to you. You will have a Zoom funeral. You are 2020, but thanks to the devoted, exhausted NHS staff." And I thought, how poignant. And that was the beginning of January. And of course, we know how bad it's been in the remaining weeks of January, with so many people being admitted to hospital, 20,000 or more. And perhaps for us, it's a question of saying, yes, I feel empty. There is a loss of human contact. No hugs. Some a loss of earnings and uncertainty about the future. Some a loss of well-being. And for some, a loss of a loved one. And we can face, therefore, spiritual, emotional, psychological depletion, possibly even feeling empty. And that all comes out for me from this simple remark of Mary to Jesus at a wedding when the wine had run out. And she says, "They have no more wine." So it could be true for us personally. It could be true for us like it was for the Jewish people spiritually. It might have been true physically as it was for the wedding, that they'd simply run out of wine. Well, that's the first kind of thing. The second thing, I just got three from this conversation, is what Mary again says to Jesus. She says these words. She says these words. Do whatever he tells you. Do whatever he tells you. I find that fascinating. I mean, you can think about Mary, and of course, she's now probably in her 40s. She must have reflected from time to time on the birth of her child, on how she came to be pregnant, on all the extraordinary happenings. And she's seen now Jesus grow up into being a man in 28. Now he's about 28. He's just beginning, we're told, his ministry. This is the first of his signs, according to John. And Mary has said to Jesus, "They've no more wine." Now, Jesus' response is quite interesting because it's not very encouraging if you look at it. He says, "Woman," which is actually a way of addressing any woman in those days. It wasn't particularly rude. It could sound a bit rude to us in our culture. "Woman, why do you involve me?" Why are you dragging me into this? My hour has not yet come. It's rather enigmatic, isn't it, of Jesus? And there are occasions in the Gospels where Jesus, of course, is rather enigmatic in his response to people when they ask him for things. And I don't think it's because he won't give it to them or won't listen, but because he's kind of drawing out the person in their desire. Although he says something also rather profound, which is, my hour has not yet come. And of course, that hour will refer later, as we'll see in the Gospel, to his hour of passion and the hour of his crucifixion. Nonetheless, Mary is not put off. Do whatever he tells you, anticipating that he is going to say something thereby. And Jesus says to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. So they did what they were told, the servants. And they must have taken quite a long time filling these very large jars, some of which held over 120 liters of water, up to the brim, which is what they did. But I want to pause on that word again, do whatever he tells you, because again, I think John is not just saying something in that situation to the people then, but also he's saying something, isn't it, to everyone who reads the gospel, which is do whatever he tells you. And I think this course over Lent, and indeed this particular time in the year, is an opportunity when we can rather deliberately try and listen to God and what he may be saying to us. Yes, we listen to him in his word. We listen to him in what he says to us in creation, all the beauty that is around us. And also we can listen to him in a particular event or an occasion. A person told me this story some years ago. I've always remembered it. He was a guy who was running away from home. He was a young man. And he was running away from Edinburgh. And he stowed away on a train going down from Edinburgh to King's Cross in London overnight. He didn't really know why exactly he was running away, what he was going to do, but he took the train, he got down to London, he woke up wherever he was on the train, and he looked across at the neighboring track where another train was stationary, and it was a goods train. It was some years ago. And on the side of the goods wagon in chalk was written these words for the railway employee: go back to Edinburgh. That was a word about that truck going back to Edinburgh, not staying in King's Cross. This young man looked at it, and for some reason, mysterious, isn't it? He thought, well, God is speaking to me. Go back to Edinburgh. And he did. He went back, he was reconciled with his family, and he told me, and later on he became a missionary. Do whatever he tells you. And my hope is, and I'm sure your hope is, that as we go through these different conversations, we may hear something for ourselves and for our own spiritual journey. And then the third thing that I just want to draw out, the last thing, is not, in strictly speaking, the conversation between Mary and Jesus. Is the result of what happens, and it's a little conversation between the master of the feast and the bridegroom, in fact. And it's these words which we find looking at the passage in verse 10, which again are very telling, where the master of the feast says, you, the bridegroom, he doesn't even know anything about this, the bridegroom, remember. You saved the best till now. Because what happened, as we know the story, is that the servants were told by Jesus, having filled up all these great jars with water, to take some of the water and to pour it into the glass of the master of the feast, the ceremony. And whether it had happened in the actual jars or on the way, I'm not sure, but probably in the jars, a miracle had occurred, and this wine had been made. The water was drawn off, and the wine was served. And when the master of the banquet tasted this wine, he was amazed at what? He didn't know the quantity, in fact, because he didn't know about the jars, really, I don't suppose, but he knew about the quality. And he thought, this is a stunningly good wine. I don't know whether you know your wines in particular, but let's say it's a sort of Chateau Margaux 1995. Stunningly good wine. Okay. And the man says this, he says, everyone brings out the choice wine first of all, and then the plonk, for the guests have had too much, and they're only going to waste a good wine because they're too tipsy already. I might appreciate it. But you have saved the best wine till now. And there are two things remarkable about this. One is the exceptional quality of the wine itself, served at the end. The other thing is the extravagance of Jesus. Because actually, if you tot it up, which I have done in the past, it is well over 600 bottles of wine. Now, when I'm ordering for a wedding, and I've ordered, as I said before, on a few occasions, I might, at the outside limit for 150 people, get 200 bottles, because they've got to drive home, most of them. But this, this party had a further 600 bottles of very good wine. It was extravagant. And also it was exceptional. And again, I don't just think it's about the wine. I think it's actually John saying something about what's happening here. He's saying, isn't he? Yes, we've run out of wine, we've run out of kind of true spirituality in our nation. But Judaism, if you like, has run dry. That someone is now needed who has extravagance and who has an exceptional quality to offer, which is remarkable. Again, I go back to the prologue and to what John says before this chapter that we're looking at today. He says, out of his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Well, that ties in for me to this miracle here. The best has been saved till now, and the best, as far as God is concerned, is the giving of his Son to the world, the Word made flesh, who is the exceptional quality of spiritual life, which is now being offered to all people everywhere. And also the resources of this person are endless. In other words, the best has arrived in Christ. Yes, I do believe a miracle took place, but yes, I also believe that this was indicative of something that God was offering in the sign, because it was a sign, to everyone who understood that. Out of his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. And then we're told this marvelous sort of throwaway bit at the end of this sign, at the end of this conversation by John. He says, what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first, you remember, of the 7 signs, some of which we'll be looking at, through which he revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. Again, I find the prologue is really like an overture at the beginning of the symphony of the gospel, and the phrases that we find in the overture come up repeatedly through the whole of the gospel. And it's no surprise that we read this in the prologue. The Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And again, John picks up, doesn't he, on that phrase of glory in his summary of the sign. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. In summary, then, as I close this first of our conversations, Jesus met a situation which was dangerously close to empty, which had the potential of full embarrassment for the hosts. But they were the people who ran out of wine at their son's wedding. This would be named throughout the village and the area. But Jesus does a miracle. And the way Jesus meets us in our emptiness is, first of all, I think we need to kind of acknowledge our need, just as Mary acknowledged the need of the wedding party and said, look, they have no more wine. Then secondly, to remember that amazing phrase of Mary's in that conversation with Jesus, speaking, I think, to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Over the 7 weeks, my hope and my prayer is that we will engage with God. He will speak to us in the way that he wants to. And for our part, we may do whatever he tells us. But also to recall these amazing words at the end of the miracle, end of the sign, that you have saved the best till now. That we could try and believe that even in this awful situation that we find ourselves in, which is getting a bit better in our country and indeed the world, which is caused by the pandemic, that even in this situation, we can find the best, which is on offer to us. The grace upon grace that comes from his fullness. So I think it's a wonderful beginning, this sign. And, you know, I've said this when I've spoken on this before. I said, you know, if I was asked what would be the first miracle that the Son of God would do if I didn't know this story on earth, I would probably say, you know, a great healing or a great resurrection. But the first sign that John tells us about is he produced a vast quantity of wine of exceptional quality to meet a need which he was told about by his mother. And you know, I find that absolutely marvelous because it's so unexpected and so wonderfully descriptive of what Christ has come to bring. And surely that's why it begins the gospel, to take us on then through all the other things we'll see over the coming weeks. So thank you for listening. It's a joy for me to talk about it. And I'll hand back to Gerald.